Welcome to Real Estate with Harmony. My name is Sandra Ziem, and I'm the owner-broker of Harmony Real Estate. We're doing a series of shows on real estate subjects, and today, our special guest is Neil Barrett, who is a commercial broker with Grubbs & Ellis of Northern New England, and he is also a real estate instructor. I personally have attended several of his classes, and so any mistakes I make are Neil's fault, right? Because he taught me wrong. No, of course not. Neil does, if you're looking to get a real estate license or if you're looking to renew your license, he does all of those classes. And actually, the reason I invited you was because I find you to be exact in your terminology, which when you're talking about meanings, when you're talking about content, words need to be exact, don't they? I frequently use the wrong word at the wrong time, but I've noticed that you seem to have mastered, and certainly as an instructor, you probably had to do that.
Well, I don't always get it right, but I correct myself if I misspeak, so I'll try to do that. I'll try to be concise. So,
one of the interesting things for me, Neil, is going back. Of course, since I've been in real estate for so long, I've seen tremendous change. I think I came in 1972, so I'm 40-plus years. I think the only one who's been around longer than me might be Angie Kopka.
Correct.
And wonderful lady. But that having been said, the changes have been mind-boggling. And as I look back over it, this agency thing has been one of the major changes. And I think the way I explain it to people is I always like to go through saying, in the old days, when I was young and just starting out in real estate, if there was a lawsuit, you would go to court, and the seller would have a string of representation behind them as long as the building. They would have, they would have their broker, their agent, the sub-agent, and the sub-agent's broker, plus they all had lawyers. So there'd be 5 or 6 of them back over there representing the seller, and then this little buyer would come in, and if they were lucky, they were able to afford an attorney, and they had one person. And I think a lot of this representation evolved out of that, out of what the court saw, no?
No, actually, most of the evolution since the early 90s was a byproduct of a couple of national surveys that were done in the mid to late 1980s, where they asked a recent home buyer who the agent they were working with represented. And because they had developed a relationship with a particular agent, they felt that the agent was actually working for them when actually they were what is called a seller's sub-agent. So as a byproduct of a couple of national surveys across the country, agency disclosure became mandatory. It became mandatory in the state of New Hampshire. And it was basically a disclosure to the consumer that I don't work for you, I work for the seller, I'll treat you honestly, I'll give you property disclosure. As soon as that agency disclosure form was put in front of buyers, the buyers said, okay, what do you mean you don't represent me? Who represents me? And that became the advent of buyer agency in the state of New Hampshire. And because of that, agency has evolved, as you mentioned, it changes. So the buyer agency took hold in the early 1990s, and now it's very dominant in New Hampshire as well as other states because buyers are seeking help and representation in a transaction.
So the first thing that happens then, or the first thing that should happen, let's preface it that way, is when you come into a real estate company, the first thing that should be established is agency.
Agency disclosure, right. Brokerage relationship disclosure. And it doesn't have to be a physical meeting. It could be a meeting have an in-depth discussion over the phone, or it could be via email correspondence.
So what is do you know off the top of your head, the RSA? That's an RSA. It's a mandated law. It's
actually a law, but it's elaborated in the New Hampshire Real Estate Commission's administrative rules. It's REA 701.01. It's brokerage relationship disclosure. It says at the first business meeting with the consumer, the real estate licensee has to go over their agency options, have them understand agency, and the way the form is now structured, talking about the difference between customer level service and client level service. So the buyer has essentially 2 types of level of service that they can choose from. The first one is customer level service. And this is assuming this is an agent. They're not working with the owner's representative. They're working with an agent that is not the owner's representative. So they have a choice between customer level service, which in New Hampshire is called facilitator, and they have a client level service option, which is buyer agency. And in New Hampshire, to be a buyer's agent, the buyer and the licensee, or technically the broker, have to sign a buyer agency agreement that outlines the relationship. So the consumer has two choices, and buyer agency in New Hampshire is comparatively strong and evolved compared to some other states because of the mandatory nature of mandatory contract for buyer agency. So starting in the early 90s, the mandated contracts, the Real Estate Commission mandated contracts, and the law mandated contracts to establish an agency relationship. So licensees are forced to have discussions up front with the buyer consumer, or the tenant consumer, because it applies to leasing as well, who the licensee is going to work for or not work for.
And to me, always the issue with that is that when people first knock on your door, most of them aren't really ready for this conversation, because it's a big decision. I mean, you're choosing who you're going to trust. I mean, it's a trust relationship to me. Now, maybe you don't see that, but when somebody is going to be, to me, client signifies that I represent them. They are my client.
Correct.
So I owe them my fiduciary, my loyalty, my best effort.
Correct.
My best practice. And so to me, that's a trust. To me, trust is such a significant thing. And if you're coming in off the street and they don't know, now, I mean, sometimes you get referrals and there is a trust already there in that someone has confided in them that they trusted you because you did well with them. So that's one thing. But when they walk in off the street and they don't know you from Adam, that's a pretty tough thing. Tell us about this contract. Now, you're saying
Well, let's back it up a second.
Okay.
So basically, the consumer walks through the door, there's a meeting, there's a phone call, whatever it is. The buyer has two choices. The buyer, ultimately, the buyer wants the higher level of service. However, they don't know the licensee yet, and they may be reluctant to sign a contract, a buyer agency agreement. So that is where facilitator, formerly known as non-agency, came in. And it was an evolution in the state of New Hampshire. Facilitator grew out of the evolving buyer agency issues in the state of New Hampshire. And basically, the facilitator relationship is a customer level relationship that allows the licensee and the buyer to work together, look at properties, get good customer level service without getting all the fiduciary benefits of buyer agency. At some point in time, like you said, the level of trust develops where the buyer is now more willing to enter into a buyer agency contract to receive those higher level of services. Without that contract, the licensee can't give that higher level of service. It's state law. So facilitator was designed as a growing, as some other people say, as a dating period. Okay, the people get to know each other. The buyer and the licensee get to know each other. And then when they're ready to make a commitment to each other, then they upgrade to buyer agency with a contract.
So, geez, I hope everybody got that. I find it, I've been 40 years and I still find it complex. I tell you very honestly. But I think I understand what you're saying. I just hope that it is a lot to absorb if you haven't heard it before.
A couple of things is that buyers are getting more educated. Okay,
and that's a good thing.
That's a good thing, and all of society is getting educated, and because of the internet, you can
information is readily available.
You can Google something, you can Bing something, I guess now, and it's basically there's articles out there on the home buying process, and one of the things those articles talk about is, who represent, you get someone representing a seller, and the buyers have an opportunity to have buyer representation. Buyers want buyer representation, okay? And different states have different laws, okay? In the state of New Hampshire, to be a buyer's agent, there has to be an agreement. Just over the border in Massachusetts, a licensee can be a buyer's agent without a contract. Buyer agency contracts are optional.
So a contract, you mean a formal written document wherein you state the terms of that
Correct.
contract. For instance, you would say how long it's going to be.
Beginning and end date, the term.
And the monies.
The professional fee.
And I find it interesting that that becomes very different because of the antitrust. Am I approaching that correctly?
Well, there are antitrust laws about collusion. It's not really a big issue. First, occasionally you'll see antitrust violations, but most there's a lot of competition.
Yes, indeed.
And because of competition, and the key thing about fees is whether or not they're on the listing side where the seller's hiring a broker to market the property, or on the buyer agency side, all fees are negotiable. And because there's plenty of real estate agents out there, it would be almost impossible for agents to collude and charge the same fee. First off, it's against federal law. It's an antitrust violation. When things were less complex and there were less real estate licensees and less firms out there, potentially in a small market, there would be the potential for it. But, for example, in the greater Nashville market, there must be 30 or 40 firms. To get all those, it would be like herding cats. So theoretically, there's the potential. It's against the law. But basically, you can't go too high in your fees because people would choose someone else. And you couldn't go too low and make a business decision because you have overhead, you have expenses. And just like any other professional service, whether or not it's legal fees or accounting fees or mechanics, the market tends to normalize and you have a range of fees within the marketplace. And basically, the key thing is all fees are negotiable between the broker, the contracted broker/licensee, and the buyer or seller consumer. So fees are negotiable. I wouldn't worry too much about collusion and antitrust because theoretically it's possible, but it would be very difficult.
It seems to me that there was some terminology about, for instance, in classes, in some of the real estate classes, they don't talk about commission fee structure at all because they don't want to get into this broker A charges X,
Correct.
Broker B charges X plus, broker C charges X plus plus
Right.
plus.
Correct.
And so they stay away from dialogue. So the only way a consumer would know what the different structures are would be for them to visit several real estate companies and get that information firsthand. Am I correct?
Yeah. Just
So
like interviewing
let your
attorneys.
fingers do the shopping.
Well, just like attorneys or mechanics or dentists, doctors.
Yeah.
There's a spread of fees in every profession, and the real estate profession is one where it's
No different than any other.
no different than
It's
any other.
competitive and let the best man win. And to be honest with you, being in politics, I find that what real estate does, I think, is teaches you to think on your feet. It teaches you to think for yourself. At least that's what I feel. I'm not sure real estate is so competitive that it's very hard to survive, in my view. But especially in the last 3 or 4 years, we've seen a falling away of an awful lot of agents because they weren't able to make enough money to survive because of the economy. At least that's what I would say. Maybe you see that different.
I think that real estate is just like any other profession. If you work hard, you work smart, you understand what you're doing, you can make a living. If you don't do that, then you're not going to be able to compete against other agents that do. So and it all depends on how much time and effort someone puts into the real estate profession.
So let's go back and talk about the difference in the buyer broker and the transaction broker or the facilitator.
Okay, so
The differences in the two, basically.
So basically, there's client level service and there's customer level service, and There's an agency, a brokerage relationship disclosure form that's available on the Real Estate Commission's website. And it basically outlines the difference in the level of service, client versus customer. Customer is good service, you get property disclosure, you get honesty, and just good customer level service. And the client level of service, the licensee can give the buyer consumer
Advice?
advice. They can advocate for them, give them one of the key elements of buyer agency or a client relationship is confidentiality. Anything your client says stays with the licensee. That's not necessarily the case in a customer relationship. It can be offered. The law allows confidentiality in a customer relationship under the facilitated relationship if it's agreed to between the consumer and the licensee / broker. But it's a higher level of service. The buyer wants that higher level of service, okay? It's just human nature, okay? The challenge, it's not a challenge, it's just state law that for the buyer to obtain that higher level of service, they have to enter into a buyer agency contract, okay? So
if that's the case, then why would they ever go to dual agency?
we'll get to dual agency in a little bit.
I don't want to complicate things too quick.
So basically, the educated consumers going on the internet, they're understanding the home buying process. Right off the bat, the articles say you want a buyer's agent, okay? Now, Massachusetts, almost everybody's a buyer's agent because there's no contract allowed, okay? So the buyers want it, the licensee gives it to them, okay? In New Hampshire, the buyer says, I want all the benefits of buyer agency, and the licensee by law in the state of New Hampshire says, if that's the case, we need to enter into an agreement, okay, where I'm going to give you this higher level of service, okay, and parts of the buyer agency agreement are, as we talked about, the beginning and end date, okay, the term, the execution date, the date it's signed.
So in the old days, again, going back to my 45-year history, in the old days, it was always the co-broke. It was always...
We're going to get to that.
Okay.
We're going to get to that.
I'll try to be patient.
Okay. So names and addresses of the party, beginning and end date, the term, the execution date, and then the two key elements of the buyer agency agreement. What does buyer searching for? General description, location, price range of real estate sought. So there's a discussion with the licensee. And this is a discussion that you have under a facilitated relationship as well, because the licensee is trying to find out what the buyer is looking for. Where do they want to live, how much do they want to spend, and what type of house or property they're looking for. So that's a discussion between the licensee and the buyer consumer off the bat anyway. But in a buyer agency contract, that is a term required in the contract. So there's a clear understanding between the licensee and the buyer client what the site search is looking for. And then the other thing is the professional fee. And the administrative rules say the professional fee stated as a dollar amount, percentage, or other specific consideration. All buyer agency fees are negotiable.
So what happens if let's say they've described, let's say that they say they want a ranch and they don't want it not to exceed $200,000.
Mm-hmm.
And so if they decide that they want to spend $250,000 now, does that nullify that contract?
Not necessarily. Basically, it's good practice that buyer agency contract should be modified, okay, to reflect the new criteria. But if the buyer agent's doing their job, okay, and all contracts can be interpreted by the courts. I think that if a good buyer agent does their job, the buyer's not going to try to do something odd on them, okay? So buyer's criteria change, okay? I heard, I don't do residential real estate. I only do commercial real estate as a practicing licensee, as a practicing broker. However, through education and teaching, I teach a lot of residential agents. And one of the interesting comments I heard the other day, I heard over the years, is that buyers never like splits as a housing style. That's one thing I heard from residential licensees. Buyers don't like the split level housing situation. However, as I understand it, some buyers are now beginning to address that because now their kids are coming back and moving into the house, and now it's like two different houses.
It's an in-law.
It's not an in-law because that has different
No,
rules and
but
regulations and that type of
But they're
stuff.
going to have family down there.
They're going to have family down there type of situation, whereas before they wanted a more, I guess, cohesive family unit lifestyle where the split may or may not have worked. But now you get adult children that are coming back from college or whatever. They may have been off at college, had been living in their own apartments, their own dorm rooms, whatever, just to save expenses. Now you get, there's still only one
Changing
kitchen in the
needs.
house, but now you have different space in the house type situation. So
It's a little more separation.
a little more separation. So the licensee and the buyer, it's an evolving process. So at the beginning, when you put general description, location, price range in the buyer agency contract, the buyer has what they're thinking of. But once they start going out and looking at properties, what they're looking for may
Changes.
change.
Yes.
You know,
Sometimes what they were thinking wasn't with the real world.
right. So, so that's whether or not that's in a facilitator relationship or a buyer agency relationship. That's always going to happen. Okay, and that happens in my world in commercial real estate. Someone says I'm looking for a particular type of thing, and as you're going through the process, they start thinking about other things. Okay, and one priorities change. You know, location becomes more important than size. Size becomes more important than location.
So how binding are those contracts?
It's a bilateral contract between the broker/firm and the buyer consumer.
And so if they wrote it for a year, that means that if they buy a house anywhere in that year, they are bound to pay that commission,
As
correct?
long as the broker's done their job.
And that would be determined by a court of law,
By a court of law. So,
which is not a place anybody wants
no,
to head
correct.
for if they can avoid it.
So basically, there's a contract, okay, that says the real estate licensee will do certain things as a buyer's agent, okay? As that buyer's agent, there's the contract that outlines their duties and responsibilities, the Real Estate Practice Act that outlines their responsibilities, and just general overall contract law.
And the main, would you
Hold
say?
on one
Oh,
second.
I'm sorry.
So if a real estate licensee is fulfilling the terms of their contract and a buyer on the side negotiates a purchase of a property without the buyer's agent, then the buyer's agent, the broker, can enforce that contract. That's the key thing is that you can enforce a contract if you're performing on the contract. If a licensee is not performing on the contract, not working with the buyer, not calling the buyer, then the buyer can make the case.
But if you went to a court of law, it's very time consuming, isn't it?
Yes. Once again, very seldom.
It doesn't happen often, thank God.
It doesn't happen often because most licensees don't want to be in a
Adversarial.
adversarial relationship with the consumer. They're going to, if it's not working out, both parties are going to want to get out of the agreement. It's just like, it's human nature type situation. And that is where one of the things that the buyer agency contract is how the system works. And in the boilerplate realtor buyer agency contract, it says, you understand I'm going to be if it's an exclusive buyer agency contract, which is commonplace, you understand that my firm will be your exclusive buyer's agent, or I will be your exclusive buyer's agent.
So how long would you say, if in worst case, if it went to a court of law, how long would you guesstimate? A year?
I have no idea.
It's at least a year, would you say that?
I've never had to do it.
That's a good thing. I haven't either. That's one of the things I'm most proud of, that I have never ended up actually in a court of law facing a judge over any of my, and I'm very proud of that. I often boast of that, to be honest with you.
So the two challenges from the buyer consumers, and I've used three terms: consumer, customer, and client. Okay, the consumer is the buyer or the tenant. Okay, they're a consumer of our services, and they can choose two types of service: the client level service and the customer level service. Okay, and by law, those are defined. Okay, the biggest issue, there are two issues from the consumer's point of view, the buyer tenant's point of view, with buyer agency, is the contract. It's a binding agreement, and compensation. Okay, buyers don't believe, it's a common assumption by buyers that they don't have to pay for representation. Okay, the law says, and the rules say, compensation has to be discussed. So basically, going back to that buyer agency agreement, the professional fee stated as a dollar amount, percentage, or other specific consideration. So when the licensee and the buyer are going over that buyer agency contract, they have to talk about how that licensee will get paid under all circumstances. Is there a cooperating fee being offered? Is there no cooperating fee being offered? What is the cooperating fee being offered? What if it's a for sale by owner? So basically, there's a discussion of how the licensee will get paid under all circumstances. A co-broke, low co-broke, no co-broke, it's a for sale by owner. All those things are addressed in that buyer agency contract. Now,
and that's why I would be afraid of Massachusetts not having that contract, because it would lead to misunderstandings, no?
I think New Hampshire, because of the contract, it really forces licensees and the buyers to address issues.
To discuss, yes.
Up front, clearly.
I used to say no surprises. People hate surprises.
Right. So, what a co-broke is it's a cooperating fee. When a seller lists a property in the state of New Hampshire, okay, they have a contract with the seller's agent, the listing agent. And that listing agent says, this is what I'm going to be charging, okay? And through the multiple listing system, NARIN, which is an MLS, multiple listing system, basically listing brokers, with the consent and acknowledgement of the seller, offer out of what is known as a cooperating fee. The cooperating fee says to all the other licensees in the marketplace, if you bring me a ready, willing, and able buyer, I will share part of my fee from the seller with you. Okay? Now, sometimes those cooperating fees vary. Okay? And
I believe your verbiage was low fee, high fee.
But
you're right. That's a good way to say it.
But they vary.
Yes, they do vary.
And there's nothing wrong with variation.
No. As long as you know up front. No surprises.
Right. And if the listing firm is a realtor, which is not all real estate licensees are realtors, about 1/3 of licensees are realtors, okay, in the state of New Hampshire. So you have a real estate agent, a real estate licensee. They're regulated and governed by the New Hampshire Real Estate Commission. Out of those licensees, about 1/3 of them voluntarily choose to join the realtor organization, okay? And by voluntarily joining that realtor organization, they adhere to an additional set of standards, which is the Realtor Code of Ethics. And part of the Realtor Code of Ethics says when you're talking with your seller client or your landlord client, you have to discuss other agents, cooperation with other agents. It's not mandated. Cooperation with other agents, and what type of compensation or cooperating fee will you be offering. So the seller understands what it is. Now, for the non-realtor licensees, it's not as explicit under state law. However, one of the fiduciary duties is disclosure, okay? In my opinion, just Neil Barrett's opinion, I'm not the Real Estate Commission, is that what is offered as a cooperating fee does impact the marketability of a property.
Absolutely, it does. I agree with you.
And because of that, I think under the broad disclosure duties from a listing agent to a seller, a seller's agent to a seller, I would say that would fall under it. Now, the Real Estate Commission has never been explicitly said that, but they were never asked the question either. However, the seller says, okay, we negotiate a fee, this is how much is being offered as a cooperating fee, and then the person working with the buyer, if they bring that buyer to that particular seller's property, if they can demonstrate that they were the one that brought that ready, willing, and able, they would earn the cooperating fee. So the buyer says, well, you're getting that fee from that person over there, why do I have to pay you? Well, all fees are negotiable. Sometimes there isn't a fee over there. Sometimes there's a nominal fee. But so that's where that contract with the buyer outlines the...
I think the public sometimes has the misunderstanding that it's all equal, and it certainly is not. It depends.
All fees are negotiable.
Yes.
Both when working with the seller and both working with the buyer. All fees are negotiable. And you have to, whether or not you're signing a contract with the seller, the broker signing a contract with the seller, okay? And let me go back a second. When we're talking about contracts, all the contracts are with the firm, not the individual licensee.
And that's an important thing, too.
Right. So when a licensee, when the contract's signed with the seller consumer, it's with the firm, not with the individual agent in the firm. It's with the firm. Same thing with the buyer agency contract.
So that means if that agent should leave that firm, they would transfer you to another agent with that firm?
Not necessarily.
Okay, what does it mean?
It just means that if there's a contract with the firm between the seller and the broker, the firm. Now, there's a separate contract between the firm and the individual licensees. And in that contract between the firm and the individual licensee, that would address what would happen if
When they leave.
When they leave.
If they should leave.
Does it stay with the firm? Does the firm and then get assigned to another agent, or does the firm release the seller from the contract so that they can continue to work with the?
And that varies also, correct?
That varies. Once again, it's all outlined between the contract between the broker/firm and the individual licensee.
That's why that word trust is so important in my vocabulary. I think trust is when you're dealing with somebody, whoever they happen to be, there needs to be trust.
Right.
Because ultimately things happen, things change, they evolve. And as they do, what will happen? That if you trust that person, then I like to think that over the years I've been accountable, and I certainly think you have, Neil. So, and I think most are. I mean, every industry has.
Well, it's
excuse me.
There's some phrase out there, it takes years to build a reputation and a minute to kill it.
Absolutely.
So,
and a bad word goes 50 miles faster than a good one. People say good things and nobody hears it. Right. But boy, if they badmouth you, it goes a long way.
I think that if you're, whatever profession you're in, if you approach it as a profession, and you do the right thing, you're going to be successful as long as you work at it. You know, it's a small business.
So that we can, because I do want to spend some time on disclosed dual agency.
We'll get to that.
Yeah, but the key difference, the key to this difference in these representations is confidentiality. Am I hearing that?
Yes. Once again, by law, a client under contract by law is entitled to confidentiality.
So what that means is, for the public that might be listening, I'm not sure they always understand our glossing over of things, because these are things we talk about a lot and they obviously don't. But I think to me what that means is that if they tell me their income, if they tell me why they're selling, or if they tell me why they're buying, or any things that might work to their disadvantage, those things are very confidential.
Correct.
I would not want you to disclose if I told you my income, I certainly wouldn't want you to tell everybody how poor I am. So they're sensitive things. You know, when you're selling a house to somebody for that period of time, that window of when they're looking and actually end up purchasing, you become an integral part of their, you become, or in my experience anyway, I've always become
Right.
personal friends.
Right. And now, once again, under seller agency, that's a client relationship. The seller, by law, is entitled to confidentiality. Buyer agency, which is a client relationship, the buyer client / tenant client is entitled to confidentiality by law. In a facilitator / customer relationship, they're not entitled to confidentiality by law. However, the law says they can be offered confidentiality, and for the protection of both the consumer and the licensee, if you're offering confidentiality in a facilitator relationship, best thing is to do is put it in writing. But one of the benefits is that of a client relationship is that because of that confidentiality, you can truly ask the buyer deeper and more specific questions because whatever they say stays with them. That benefit of confidentiality, you can dig a little bit deeper as to their thought processes of why they want to live in a certain location. For example, someone's getting a new job in Manchester, okay? And they want to be within a 30-minute commute of Manchester. Well, that's north of, if that's north of Concord, just north of it. That could be all the way out to, Epping, Raymond, Epping. It could be south to Nashua and even over the border. But if you can, you're probably not going to live in Massachusetts. And it could be Amherst and Hollis. So you talk covering this wide range of real estate. So in a buyer agency relationship, and you can do it to some extent in a facilitator, but really in a buyer agency, why are you thinking about these communities versus these communities and all that type of stuff? And some people want to be, in a busier area, okay? So they want to be in a city. Other people want
I always
3
wanted to be
acres
in
of
the
land.
city. Yeah,
3 acres of land, a little bit more quiet. They
privacy.
They have privacy, or they just want a big yard for their kids, their pets, whatever it is. Everybody's different, so, but that's one of the benefits now. You keep coming back to that dual agency.
Well, I just don't want to, I think dual agency is more controversial. I agree with you that most people obviously do want to buy a broker because it's obvious to their advantage.
Correct. Now, dual agency occurs in some firms, where, once again, the contract is with the firm. So in what is known as a non-designated agency firm, okay? Now, the firm has a seller agency contract with the seller, okay? And then they have a buyer agency contract with the buyer, okay? So say in your company, you, quote unquote, have someone in your office is the listing agent. And the term listing agent means the person who's developed, the individual licensee who's developed a relationship with the seller, get the seller to list their property with the firm. So the contract is still with the firm. So that individual agent is a listing agent, but the whole firm represents the seller. Now you have either that agent, or more likely, the vast majority of dual agency has 2 different agents in the same firm, okay? That someone else in the firm has been working with a buyer, and quote unquote, they're the buyer's agent. Once again, that buyer agency contract is with the firm. So if that buyer client who's looking for a house says, hey, I like that in-house listing, okay? Now the firm has a buyer client and a seller client in the same transaction, and state law allows what is known as disclosed dual agency with the informed consent of both the buyer and the seller saying, okay, we got a little bit of a situation here. We represent you as a buyer's agent. We're supposed to be promoting your interest. We got a seller client. We're supposed to be promoting your interest. Now you're both, the seller's interested in selling to this buyer, and this buyer's interested in buying this property.
Conflict of interest.
It's now, basically, the broker is now, his role has changed. Once again, this can only be done with the informed,
Disclosed.
not
Informed. Go ahead.
disclosed
I'm
dual
sorry.
agency. It's not disclosure, it's informed consent. A broker can't simply say,
Yes,
I'm a dual agent.
yes, you're right.
They have
I'm
to go to the
sorry.
buyer and seller client and say, will you, this is the situation, for us to proceed in this transaction, our role is going to have to be modified. Will you allow us to modify our roles? So now the dual agent's role, you can't advocate for one party over another, okay? Confidentiality is a key component of dual agency. Whatever the seller says stays with the seller. Whatever the buyer says stays with the buyer. Now the broker is now bringing the parties together, helping them through the process, and making sure that both clients' needs are met. But you can't, you have to be very careful about giving advantage to one over the other, okay, because they're both clients. And that is what is known, that's a non-designated agency, where the agency relationship is at the office level, or the broker level, the firm level, not the office level, the firm level, because some firms have multiple offices. There are some designated, what are designated agency firms, where you have less frequency of dual agency because you don't automatically become a dual agent in a scenario. If you have one agent that has the buyer client and one agent that has the seller client, that's not automatically dual agency in this designated agency model. And that's been in New Hampshire 3, 4, probably 4 years now. And it all comes down to the firm. You know, smaller firms don't have a lot of dual agency because so they haven't gone to this designated agency model. Some of the very large firms who have a lot of agents, have a lot of listings, I mean houses for sale, and have a lot of buyer-client relationships, they were seeing a lot of in-house dual agency, and those firms have gone to the designated agency model. But the key thing about whether or not it's a non-designated agency model or a designated agency model, the duties to the consumer are exactly the same. Seller agency is the same, buyer agency is the same, facilitator is the same, disclosed dual agency is the same. It's a business model, and it's a byproduct of the size of a company. So, you know, there's, you know, my firm is not a designated agency firm. I can't imagine that yours is. You're a quote-unquote traditional firm.
Well, in my company, that would be even more difficult because there's so much family.
Right.
And in a court of law, I think they might find it hard to believe that we didn't share information with each other, because sometimes you do it without intending to even.
Correct.
Sometimes even body language, you can disclose things that you didn't intend to. So for my purposes, and I always have this thing, bottom line is, you know, is always informed consent. When we take the listing, I always go through, you know, what disclosed dual agency is, and ask them if they're willing to do that. And then
will they consider it? You talk about it, saying this thing could occur in the future. If there's the potential for this to occur in the future, then we'll come back and have a separate discussion.
Well, and that's what I do. Then when in the office, if it comes to the point where we have somebody who is dual agency, then at the point, yes, potential, then at the point of their interest, I pick up the phone and call the seller and say, we have some folks now, they would be disclosed dual agency.
Once again, it's a buyer-client. It's not a buyer-customer. The only thing
See, this is where the language, and that's why I had you, to be honest with you, because you are very exacting with your language.
Right.
And it's confusing when people like me use the wrong word, the public.
Right. So the only thing that triggers a dual agency situation is a buyer-client interest in the seller-client's property. Okay? If it's a buyer-consumer, that's not dual agency. Okay? For example, a buyer sees your sign, calls you up, says, I'd like to see that property. When that buyer meets you with the property, you pull out a brokerage relationship disclosure form, an agency disclosure form, and say, by the way, I represent the seller. Okay? And most buyers in a situation like that will say, okay, I understand that. Your sign's on the property, I understand you represent the seller. I'm going to treat you, I'm going to give you customer level service, I'm going to give you property information, I'm going to treat you honestly, I'm going to help you through the process, okay? Now, there might be a situation where a buyer client, under a buyer agency agreement, becomes interested in a company listing under the non-designated agency. That's where the dual agency occurs. So what is known as a straight sale, meaning the buyer comes directly to the listing agent, or an in-house sale, meaning two agents of the same firm, is not automatically dual agency. The only thing that triggers dual agency is a buyer-client interest in the seller-client's property.
Well, but there are certain circumstances under which you almost are forced to go into. For instance, if my daughter were interested, one of my daughters that doesn't sell real estate, and I have 5 children, so I have some in both. My one daughter, when she bought a house, right away, anything that Harmony has to be
Right.
dual agency.
Understood.
And so, and any pre-existing, like I have customers that still do business with me that I did business with 20 years ago, 25 years ago. Those people, there's a pre-existing relationship with them.
But you have to, once again, you have to formalize that pre-existing relationship.
The state, the requirement is that it has to be, yes, with a contract.
Correct.
Yes.
Just because you had a past agency relationship with someone doesn't mean that agency relationship continues into the future. The only type of duty that survives an agency relationship or the term of an agency relationship is confidentiality.
And to me, some of this is just common sense. I mean, if people are confiding their personal information to you, I think that
and that's where the agency disclosure form, the brokerage relationship disclosure form, on 3 different spots on the state mandated form. There's one state mandated form. On the top, it essentially says, do not disclose confidential information. In the description of customer relationship, it says, do not disclose confidential information. And right above the consumer's signature, it says, do not disclose confidential information. So that's one of the true benefits of agency, a buyer agency, is confidentiality.
and seller agency as well.
Seller agency as well.
Because absolutely. For instance, if I have a house listed and people come in to buy it, and I'm asking just arbitrarily, let's say it's $200,000, and I say to them, oh, these people take $180,000. That wouldn't be too much in the interest of my seller, would
Correct.
it? So that's the kind of violation that the Real Estate Commission is trying to, and the thought that goes through my mind with all this dialogue is that more is expected from the professional, from the agent. For instance, sometimes without knowing it, buyers and sellers will tell you things and they don't even realize they've told
Correct.
you because it just flowed out. But now you have access to this personal information.
Mm-hmm.
And so the greater responsibility is on you because you know, as a professional, you've had this training, you've heard all of this, all these seminars and experts like yourself who hopefully have impressed upon us the seriousness of these things.
Right. In some of my classes, I use the power of the word, the letter Y, from a listing agent's point of view. Okay, buyer's interest in the property, they're not sure. A listing agent or a seller's agent can say to the buyer, "Well, make an offer. We'll see if it goes anywhere." Okay, so an offer, offer. Just say, I don't know what the seller's gonna. I don't know what the seller's willing to accept. You got to start the process somewhere. Make an offer. Whereas if a listing agent said, they'll consider any offer. If you add a Y, any offer, in my opinion, that gives away some of the seller's motivation. You get a motivated seller.
And motivation is the easiest thing to give away, in my view, because, for instance, you might think it nothing, and you might say, "Oh, they're getting a divorce." Hello, is that critical to how fast they want to sell? I think it is. If I were married to somebody I didn't want to be with, quick would be a word that I would jump on. Right. So, and I do see that done, and I try very hard not to do that.
Well,
it's easy to do.
And some of the questions that buyers will ask, well, why are the sellers moving? Okay, and I bring that question up in class. And I heard from a former member, a very experienced agent, long-term agent, former member of the Real Estate Commission. And I don't know whether or not it came up in a Real Estate Commission hearing or just an informal meeting, the real estate, a subcommittee meeting and stuff. And she gave the best response that every agent in the world does, which is when a buyer asks the listing agent, why is the seller moving? Okay, because they're trying to get some information, motivation, all that type of stuff.
Yes.
And her pat response was, the seller's moving, so they're not there when you move in.
Yes. I have heard people say why they're moving is not pertinent to the value
Right.
of this property.
Correct.
What's pertinent to the value of this property is the market.
Right.
If you're asking questions about the market, most of that stuff is public knowledge, public information. But if you're asking me for personal information, it goes. But gratefully enough, you don't hear that happen as often. This agency, to some extent, has
Yeah, well, there's
caused
people
it to
always,
cease a little bit.
and it's an interesting thing that every now and then the buyer will ask, what did the seller pay for the property?
Oh,
That's an irrelevant question.
absolutely irrelevant. If they've been in it 20 years, it certainly isn't worth what it was 20 years ago.
Right. Well, and the interesting thing is that the buyers are saying, well, they're entitled to some appreciation, but not. And the response, when I ever hear, over the past 5 or 6 years, I've heard agents say, I just wait for that question, because good question. The property's worth $260, but they paid $300 for it. They're willing to accept $300. So property values move property values move in different directions.
In this market, it's
In market value, the current value of a property is not necessarily what the seller paid for it. Okay, it's what the current market is, and it's in comparison to other available properties on the market as well as recent sales. It's
So is there anything you'd like to share with our audience before we wind this down?
Basically, if you're more interested in looking at that brokerage relationship disclosure form, you can go to the Real Estate Commission's website, which is
That's a great idea.
nh.gov/NHREC. So nh.gov, which is the state website for the state of New Hampshire. And then you just do a / with NHREC, which is the New Hampshire Real Estate Commission. And basically with the internet nowadays, the key thing is that they understand there's in the state of New Hampshire, there's client level of service and there's customer level service. Client level service requires a commitment on their part to a licensee and a firm. Customer relationship, you can still get good service, but you're not getting all the bells and whistles.
And I would, just from my personal perspective, I encourage young people to talk to 2 or 3 different people before they make a decision, so that they're making, every person you talk to gives you more information. The more information you have, the better decision you're going to make for yourself to protect your interests. And that's why this, like being able to go to the Real Estate Commission to their website, is a valuable tool, because now you walk into that office already knowing what they're going to ask you to sign. And in the old days, and maybe they're not doing it anymore, but in the old days, they used to, if you didn't want to sign that when you first came in because you weren't ready, they asked you to sign something that said you didn't want to sign it.
Correct.
They still do that, right?
But once again, we're talking about 2 different documents. Okay, there's the brokerage relationship disclosure form, or the agency disclosure form, that says just giving the person a little bit of education on the different agency relationships and the difference between customer and client level service. And right at the top of that form, it says, this disclosure form, it says, this is not a contract. So the vast majority of consumers are not afraid of signing that form because they understand it's not a contract, it's an educational piece. It's a disclosure piece. However, there is a provision, and at the bottom of the form, that if the consumer is unwilling to sign it, there's a box that can be checked. the form, the other document that consumers are more concerned about is a contract. The listing contract, the seller agency contract to put a house on the market, and a buyer agency, more specifically a buyer agency contract. Listing contracts, seller agency contracts have been around forever. So this basically, if all the terms are acceptable to the seller to put their house on the market understands that they're going to be signing a contract. More education and more understanding on the buyer's part that if they want the higher level of service in the state of New Hampshire, they do have to enter into a buyer agency contract. And that, like we talked about, requires education, discussion, and going over the contract. It's a very, if you look at the boilerplate form out, the contract out there, it is a very detailed form. It talks about the licensee's duties, the buyer's duties, how the process, somewhat of how the process works, yep, and the level of service that the buyer is going to receive.
Well, I would say that if anybody is interested in selling real estate, they should call Neil Barrett School of Real Estate?
Just Barrett School. Yeah.
Barrett School of Real Estate.
And that's also on the Real Estate Commission's website.
Oh, so there you have it. Let's go to that website. Everything will be answered, right?
Right. There's the disclosure form. I think there's a couple of consumer information pieces. You can look up the schools. You can also look up a licensee status. So make sure that the person's licensed.
Not only that, does it also say then how long they've been licensed?
It should, yes. Yeah. I think it's when they...
So that would tend to tell them the experience that that agent might have.
I think that...
To some extent.
Yes and no. I think that whether or not you're in the business 1 year or 15 years, the consumer is going to be able to determine on their own through asking questions and all that type of stuff who they're comfortable working with. So I wouldn't say...
One shoe doesn't fit all.
One shoe doesn't fit all.
Everybody's different. Well, we appreciate the audience staying with us and listening to this. Hope that all of their real estate will be with Harmony. And thank you for sharing your information and for being so precise. And that's when you're studying real estate, these terminologies, they're very precise. They're very specific, you have to be, and sometimes those of us who don't deal with it every single day, it's easy for us to use just the, interchange some of those terminologies and get them mixed up. So I appreciate those of you who keep us straight and make it, well, because that's a necessary thing. And so I appreciate your contributions to our community, and I hope anybody looking for real estate, commercial real estate certainly, look up Neil Barrett at Grubbs and Ellis, Northern New England.
Grubb and Ellis, Northern New England.
Northern New England. So does that mean they have other?
Grubb and Ellis is a national company, and they have what are known as corporate offices in the major cities like Boston, and then they have affiliated offices in some of the smaller markets. So we're an affiliated company for New Hampshire, part of Maine, and Vermont.
Well, thank you for being here, and thank everybody for listening to Real Estate with Harmony.
There you go.
Nice to have you.
Thank you.